I stared at the laminated card in my hands, reading the rules for what had to be the 5th time since Julie handed them to me 20 minutes ago. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps, and the whole place smelled like industrial cleaner mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. "So these are real?" I asked Keith, who was crouched next to me sorting through boxes of phone chargers. "Like actual safety protocols?" He glanced up from the inventory sheet he'd been scribbling on. "What do you mean?" I held up the card. "Rule number 1 literally says you're dead. That's not exactly standard workplace safety material." Keith's pen stopped moving. For a second, something flickered across his face. Not confusion, but something sharper, almost like panic. Then he shrugged and went back to his counting. "Julie's got a weird sense of humor, I guess. Don't overthink it." But the way he said it didn't match the way his shoulders had tensed up. I'd gotten pretty good at reading people during my 2 years of bouncing between retail jobs, and Keith was definitely not telling me something. "Have you actually seen these rules before?" I pressed. "Nope." He didn't look up this time. "First night seeing them, same as you." Which was weird, because when Julie introduced us earlier, she'd talked to Keith like they'd worked together for months. She'd asked him about the usual sections and mentioned something about him knowing the routine better than anyone. Now he was claiming he'd never seen the basic safety rules. I decided to let it slide for now. I needed this job too much to start interrogating my coworkers on day 1, or night 1 technically. Keith stood up and grabbed a box of Bluetooth speakers. "Come on, I'll show you where these go. The storage system back here is kind of complicated." I followed him toward the rear of the electronics section, past rows of televisions that reflected our movements in dark, distorted shapes. The store felt different at night, bigger somehow, like the aisles stretched further than they should. During my interview this afternoon, the place had seemed normal, busy and bright and full of the usual retail chaos. Now it felt like we were walking through the skeleton of something much larger. "So how long have you been working here?" I asked as we walked. "Not that long." Keith's answer came too quickly. "Few months, maybe." Another non-answer. I was starting to think Keith had some kind of allergy to giving me straight information. We reached a section near the back where the shelving units were taller and the lighting was dimmer. Keith set down his box and pointed to a metal door marked "Storage, Authorized Personnel Only." "Most of the overstock is back there," he said, pulling out a key card. "Julie probably didn't give you access yet, but I can show you the layout so you know where everything goes." The storage area was exactly what you'd expect. Concrete floors, metal shelving reaching up to a high ceiling, and the kind of industrial lighting that made everything look slightly green. But Keith seemed to know his way around pretty well for someone who'd only been working here a few months. "The electronics stuff is mostly over here," he said, leading me past rows of boxed merchandise. "But there's some older storage areas back by the loading dock that are kind of interesting." "Interesting how?" Keith glanced around like he was checking to make sure we were alone, then walked over to a section where the shelving was older and more beat up. "See this panel here?" He pointed to what looked like a loose piece of metal siding near the floor. Previous employees used to hide stuff behind here. Personal items, notes, whatever they didn't want management finding. He knelt down and worked the panel loose, revealing a small space behind it. Empty now, but you could see scratches in the metal where people had shoved things in and out. "How do you know about this?" I asked. "Found it by accident a few weeks ago. There were some old filing cabinets back here too, but they moved those out before I started." Keith replaced the panel and stood up. "Just thought you should know in case you ever need to, keep something safe." The way he said it made me think he wasn't talking about hiding snacks from management. But before I could ask what he meant, we heard Julie's voice echoing from the main floor. "Teresa? Keith? How's the inventory coming?" "We should get back," Keith said, already heading for the door. I followed him out of storage and back toward the electronics section, my brain trying to process everything I'd learned so far. Which wasn't much, honestly. Keith was definitely hiding something. The rules were either a joke or the weirdest safety protocols in retail history, and Molly had looked at me earlier like I was walking into a trap. But the pay was good, and I needed the money. Mom's medical bills weren't going to wait while I figured out whether my new co-workers were just eccentric or actually crazy. We'd been restocking phone accessories for about 10 minutes when I happened to look up toward the front of the store. The customer service desk was visible from where we were working, and there was someone standing behind it, organizing returns or something. Someone who looked exactly like Keith. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the fluorescent lights were messing with my vision. But no. There was definitely a person over there with Keith's exact build, his auburn hair, even the same black Supermart polo shirt. "Keith," I said slowly, not taking my eyes off the figure by customer service. "Yeah?" He was right next to me, opening another box of earbuds. "Do you have a twin brother or something?" "What? No, why would you—" I pointed toward the front of the store. "Because there's someone over there who looks exactly like you." Keith followed my gaze, and I watched his face go completely white. The box in his hand slipped and hit the floor, earbuds scattering across the linoleum. The person at customer service turned slightly, and for just a second, I could see his profile clearly. It was Keith's face, no question about it, but something was off about the way he moved. Too stiff, like he was fighting against invisible strings. "That's not possible," Keith whispered, but he couldn't seem to look away. The Keith double at customer service suddenly went very still. Then slowly, he turned to look directly at us across the length of the store. Even from this distance, I could see that his eyes were completely wrong. I stared at the two Keiths, my brain doing that thing where it just refuses to process what it's seeing. Like when you're looking at one of those optical illusions and your eyes keep trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. The Keith next to me was solid, real, breathing hard enough that I could see his chest moving. But the other one, standing by the pharmacy, there was something off about him. He looked like Keith if Keith had been filmed through old glass, slightly blurred around the edges, and the way he moved, too smooth, like he was gliding instead of walking. "That's not possible," Keith whispered again, and his voice cracked on the last word. I kept staring at the distant figure. "Keith, why does that look exactly like you?" "I don't know," but something in his voice told me he was lying. The other Keith turned his head toward us again, and this time I could see his eyes. They were the same green-blue as the Keith beside me, but they looked empty. Like someone had scooped out everything that made them human and left just the shape behind. "Keith." I grabbed his arm. "What aren't you telling me?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, very quietly, "My twin brother Kevin died here 3 years ago. Workplace accident." My stomach dropped. "Your twin brother?" "Yeah." He ran a hand through his hair, making it stick up at weird angles. "I took this job because I wanted to understand what happened. The official report didn't make sense, and my parents, they just wanted to move on. But I couldn't." I looked back toward the pharmacy, but the other Keith was gone, just empty aisles stretching out under the fluorescent lights. So that was... I don't know what that was. Keith's voice was tight. "But Kevin's been dead for 3 years. I went to his funeral. I helped carry his coffin." The way he said it made my chest hurt. I'd never lost anyone that close to me, but I could hear the grief in his voice, raw and unhealed even after all this time. "The first rule," I said slowly. "Keith Nelson is dead. Kevin Nelson." He looked at me with those tired eyes. "We're both Keith Nelson. Keith Kevin Nelson and Keith Michael Nelson. Our parents thought it was cute. Jesus." "Yeah." He picked up the package he'd dropped and started opening it again, but his hands were shaking. "So now you know why I'm really here. and why Julie looked at me like that when she read the rules. I pulled the laminated card out of my pocket and read the first rule again. Keith Nelson is dead. Do not acknowledge the Keith who works alongside you. But you're not dead, I said. No, but maybe. He trailed off, staring at the spot where the other Keith had been standing. Maybe something here doesn't know the difference. We worked in silence for the next half hour, both of us jumping every time a shelf creaked or the air conditioning kicked on. I kept glancing around, expecting to see that hollow-eyed version of Keith watching us from behind a display or around a corner. But the store stayed empty, just the two of us and the endless rows of merchandise. It wasn't until we moved to electronics that I happened to look up through the skylight. Oh shit. There were two suns in the sky. I mean, it was still night. The regular sun wasn't supposed to be up for hours. But there it was, hanging low on the horizon like it always did. Except next to it, maybe 20 degrees to the left, was another sun. This one burned with a sick green light that made my skin crawl just looking at it. Keith. My voice came out as a squeak. What now? He looked up from the tablet display he was organizing, then followed my gaze to the skylight. What the hell? The green sun was getting brighter. I could feel its light on my face through the glass, cold and wrong in a way that made my teeth ache. Rule 2, I said, fumbling for the card. If you see a second sun, hide immediately, and don't come out for 10 minutes. Teresa, that's not real. That can't be real. But even as he said it, the temperature in the store was dropping. I could see my breath starting to fog, and somewhere in the distance, I heard a sound like humming. Not human humming, something deeper and more resonant, like the store itself was vibrating. Fitting room, I said, grabbing Keith's arm. Now. This is insane. Yeah, well, so is seeing two of you, but that happened too. I dragged him toward the small fitting room tucked behind the clothing displays. 10 minutes. That's what the rule says. The fitting room was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. We squeezed inside and I pulled the curtain shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. Keith was pressed against me in the tiny space and I could feel him shaking. This isn't happening, he muttered. People don't just see extra suns. That's not how astronomy works. Yeah, well, people don't usually see dead twins either, but here we are. The humming was getting louder. Through the thin curtain, I could see that green light getting brighter and brighter, casting everything in a sickly glow. And the shadows. God, the shadows were moving. Not like they were being cast by something moving, but like they were alive, stretching and reaching across the floor independent of anything that should have been making them. Keith had gone completely still beside me. Do you see that? The shadows? Yeah. They're moving toward the light. He was right. Every shadow in the electronics section was slowly creeping toward the skylight, like they were being drawn to that green sun. Some of them were stretching impossibly long, reaching across entire aisles. I checked my phone. 7 more minutes. The humming was so loud now, it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. The green light pulsed, and with each pulse, the shadows jerked forward another few inches. The temperature kept dropping until I was shivering uncontrollably. Teresa. Keith's voice was barely a whisper. What if the 10 minutes isn't enough? What if we come out and it's still there? Then we stay hidden until it's gone. What if it doesn't go away? I didn't have an answer for that. I just pressed closer to him in the tiny space and watched the shadows creep across the floor like living things. Finally, after what felt like hours, my phone buzzed. 10 minutes. The humming had stopped. The green light was gone, leaving just the normal fluorescent store lighting. The shadows had snapped back to their regular positions, cast by displays and shelving units like shadows were supposed to be. I pushed the curtain aside and stepped out on shaky legs. The store looked normal again, but something was different. The tablet display Keith had been working on was now 3 aisles over, sitting in the middle of the grocery section. A rack of phone cases had somehow ended up in the pharmacy area. It was like someone had picked up random pieces of the store and moved them around while we were hiding. What the hell? Keith stared at the displaced merchandise. I don't know. I was still shaking, partly from cold and partly from adrenaline. But I'm starting to think those rules aren't a joke. That's when I saw Molly standing at the end of the electronics aisle, watching us. She was perfectly still, her pale blue eyes taking in the moved displays, the fitting room we'd just emerged from, our obvious terror. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her face that looked almost like recognition, like she'd seen this before. I opened my mouth to say something, but she turned and walked away without a word, disappearing around the corner toward the back of the store. Keith and I stood there in the aftermath, surrounded by merchandise that had somehow rearranged itself, and I realized that whatever was happening here was bigger and stranger than I'd thought possible. And we still had 6 hours left on our shift. I was elbow deep in motor oil bottles when the music started. At first I thought it was just Keith humming under his breath. He'd been doing that nervous thing where he reorganized the same shelf 3 times since we'd moved to automotive. But this wasn't humming. This was actual music, drifting through the store like smoke. Old jazz. The kind my grandmother used to play on Sunday mornings, all brass and melancholy. "Do you hear that?" I asked, setting down a case of transmission fluid. Keith stopped mid-reach for a spark plug display. "Yeah. Where's it coming from?" I pulled out the laminated card, scanning until I found what I was looking for. Rule 5. If you hear music playing after midnight, find the source immediately and turn it off. Do not let it play for more than 5 minutes. Why? What happens after 5 minutes? It doesn't say. The music was getting louder, echoing from what seemed like multiple directions at once. But I'm not really in the mood to find out. We left the automotive section and followed the sound through the store. It led us past grocery, past electronics, past the pharmacy where I'd seen that other Keith earlier. The melody seemed to bounce off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. "This way," Keith said, heading toward the employee areas in the back. The break room door was propped open, and that's where we found it. An old radio sitting on the shelf above the microwave, its digital display showing nothing but static. But somehow, impossibly, that haunting jazz tune was pouring out of its speakers. "How is it even playing?" Keith whispered. "There's no station coming through." I stepped toward the radio, reaching up to turn it off. "Does it matter?" "The rule says turn it off, so we turn it off." "Teresa, wait." Keith grabbed my wrist, his fingers cold and tight around my arm. He was staring at the corner of the break room, his face pale in the fluorescent light. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The shadows were moving, not shifting like shadows do when light changes, but actually moving, stretching across the linoleum floor like dark fingers reaching toward the radio. As the music played, they grew longer and darker, creeping up the walls with a purpose that made my skin crawl. "Turn it off," Keith said, his voice barely audible over the jazz. "Turn it off now." I grabbed the radio and smashed it against the wall as hard as I could. Plastic cracked, circuits scattered, and the music cut off, so abruptly it left my ears ringing. The shadows snapped back to their normal positions like rubber bands, leaving us standing in a break room that suddenly felt way too quiet. "Jesus," Keith breathed, letting go of my wrist. "Did you see how close they got?" I looked at the corner where the shadows had been reaching. There were scorch marks on the wall, thin black lines that definitely hadn't been there before. "We need to get out of here," I said. We made it to aisle 12 before either of us spoke again. Keith was leaning against a shelf of breakfast cereals, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to convince himself he was still real. "So the rules are definitely not a joke," he said. "Yeah, I'm getting that impression. And we still have 4 hours left." I was about to respond when someone cleared their throat behind us. We both spun around to find a man standing between the shelving units, like he'd just materialized out of thin air. He was maybe in his 60s, wearing a worn brown coat that looked like it had seen better decades. His hair was silver white and neatly combed, and his eyes were kind but tired in a way that suggested he'd seen more than his share of strange things. "Excuse me," he said politely, "but I don't suppose you could help me find a wrench." Keith and I looked at each other. I pulled out the rules card again, scanning until I found Rule 4. If a man in a brown coat asks for tools, retrieve them immediately and do not ask questions. "What kind of wrench?" I asked. "Oh, any kind will do. I have some repairs to make before dawn." I walked over to the tools section, which was conveniently located at the end of aisle 12, and grabbed the first wrench I saw. When I turned back, the man was still there, waiting patiently with his hands clasped behind his back. "Here you go," I said, holding out the wrench. "Thank you very much." He took it with genuine gratitude, like I'd just done him the biggest favor in the world. "I do appreciate it. These old buildings require so much maintenance, you know." "Sure," I said, even though I had no idea what he was talking about. "Well, I should get back to work. Have a pleasant evening, both of you." He turned and walked around the corner toward the back of the store. Keith and I waited exactly 3 seconds before following him. The aisle was empty. "Where did he go?" Keith whispered. I looked around, but there was nowhere to hide. The aisle stretched straight back to the wall with no side passages or doors. The man in the brown coat had simply vanished. "I don't know," I said. "But look." I pointed up at the overhead lights. All night, half the bulbs in this section had been flickering on and off, casting weird shadows and making everything feel unstable. Now they were all working perfectly, bathing the aisle in steady, warm light. Keith stared up at the fixtures. He fixed the lights, apparently, with a wrench, I guess. We stood there for a moment, processing this latest impossibility. A helpful maintenance man who appeared and disappeared at will, fixing electrical problems with basic tools. After everything else we'd seen tonight, it almost seemed normal. "You know what?" Keith said finally. "I'm not even going to question it. The lights work now. That's good enough for me." I had to agree. In a night full of moving shadows and duplicate people and impossible suns, a mysterious handyman who actually made things better was practically a relief. We walked back toward automotive, passing under the newly repaired lights, and I found myself thinking that maybe some of the weird things happening here weren't necessarily bad. Maybe some of them were just different. But I kept the rules card in my hand anyway, because we still had a long way to go until dawn. I was restocking vitamins when I saw him. A guy in a blue baseball cap moving through the pharmacy section like he was looking for something specific but didn't want anyone to notice. He kept glancing around, checking over his shoulder every few seconds, and there was something about the way he moved that made my stomach clench. "Keith," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Baseball cap guy. Pharmacy section." Keith looked up from the blood pressure monitors he was organizing. "What about him?" "Rule 5. We need to tell Julie immediately." Keith's face went serious. After everything we'd seen tonight, neither of us was taking chances with the rules anymore. We abandoned our boxes and headed toward the back office, moving quickly but trying not to look like we were running. The office door was cracked open, and I could hear voices inside. Julie's voice, tense and worried, and someone else responding in quiet tones. I knocked softly. "Come in," Julie called. We pushed the door open and found Julie hunched over a bank of security monitors, her face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple screens. Molly was standing beside her, both women looking more stressed than I'd ever seen them. The monitors showed different angles of the store, empty aisles, the pharmacy section, the loading dock. "Julie," I said, "there's a man in a blue baseball cap in the pharmacy section. He's acting really nervous, looking around constantly." Julie's face went completely white. She spun around in her chair and started typing rapidly on the keyboard, switching between camera feeds until she found the right angle. There he was, tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket under the blue cap, moving between the aisles like he was hunting for something. "Oh God," Julie breathed. "Molly, call security, now." Molly was already reaching for the phone. "Should I tell them it's him?" "Yes. Tell them Robert Weber is in the building. Banned individual, potentially dangerous." My blood went cold. "Who's Robert Weber?" Julie was still watching the monitors, tracking the man's movement through the store. "Former employee, fired 3 years ago for inappropriate behavior toward customers, stalking, making threats. He's been banned from the property ever since." Keith stepped closer to the monitors. 3 years ago? Yes. Julie's voice was tight. Right around the time... She trailed off, glancing at Keith with something that looked like guilt. Molly hung up the phone. "Security's on their way. They're coming in through the main entrance." On the monitors, we watched Robert Weber suddenly freeze and look around like he'd sensed something was wrong. Then he started moving faster, heading toward the back of the store. "He knows," Julie muttered. "Damn it, he knows." I looked between Julie and Molly, both of them watching the screens with the kind of focused intensity that suggested this wasn't their first time dealing with something like this. "How does he know security's coming?" Molly and Julie exchanged a look, and something passed between them. Some kind of silent communication that made my skin crawl. "Molly," Julie said quietly, "I think it's time." "Time for what?" Keith demanded. Molly took a deep breath and turned to face us. Her pale blue eyes looked tired, like she'd been carrying something heavy for way too long. "The rules aren't about supernatural stuff," she said. "They're coded warnings about real dangers." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" "The ghost Keith you've been seeing, the shadows, the music. Some of that's real, but not the way you think." Molly ran a hand through her blonde hair. "This building sits on an unstable foundation. There are gas leaks, electrical problems, structural issues that cause hallucinations and equipment malfunctions. The city's been trying to get corporate to fix it for years." Keith was staring at her. "But Kevin Nelson died 3 years ago," Molly said softly. "But not from an accident. He discovered that the night crew was being used to cover up corporate crimes. Someone murdered him to keep him quiet." The room went completely silent except for the hum of the monitors. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "Murdered," Keith repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Julie turned away from the monitors to face him. "Kevin found evidence that corporate executives were using the night shift to move stolen merchandise and hide embezzled funds. He was going to report it. 3 days later, he was found dead in the storage area. They called it an accident, said he fell and hit his head, but the injuries didn't match the story. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Keith's hands were clenched into fists. "Because we didn't know if we could trust you," Julie said. "For all we knew, you were working with them. It wasn't until tonight, watching how you reacted to everything, that we realized you genuinely didn't know." I was trying to process all of this, but my brain felt like it was moving through thick mud. "So the rules are my way of trying to keep people safe without explaining the whole truth," Julie finished. "If I told new employees that there were corporate killers using our store to hide evidence, no one would take the job. But if I gave them safety rules disguised as supernatural warnings, they'd follow the protocols without asking too many questions." "The Keith you've been seeing," Molly added, looking at Keith with something like sympathy. "That's probably a combination of the building's effects and your own guilt. But the other stuff, the shadows, the music, the temperature changes, those are real environmental hazards caused by the foundation problems." Keith was shaking his head. "This is insane. You're telling me my brother was murdered and you've been lying to everyone about it?" "We've been trying to gather evidence," Julie said. "I've been working with internal investigators for months, documenting everything. But it's complicated when the people you're investigating have access to corporate resources and aren't afraid to kill to protect themselves." On the monitors, Robert Weber had disappeared from view. Julie frantically switched between camera feeds, trying to track him. "Where did he go?" she muttered. "Julie," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "If Robert Weber was fired 3 years ago and Kevin died 3 years ago, Robert isn't just a stalker," Julie said without looking away from the screens. "He's connected to the people who killed Kevin, and if he's here tonight, it means they know Keith has been asking questions." Keith went very still. "They know I'm here." "Yes." Julie finally found Robert on one of the back cameras. He was heading toward the storage areas, moving with purpose now instead of nervousness. "And that means you're in serious danger." The monitors showed empty aisles, flickering lights, and somewhere in the maze of storage rooms and loading docks, a man who'd already been part of one murder and probably wouldn't hesitate to commit another. I looked at Keith, whose face had gone pale but determined, and realized our shift had just become about something much more important than following supernatural rules or earning minimum wage. It had become about staying alive long enough to get justice for his brother. Julie was already moving before I finished explaining about Robert Weber, grabbing her radio and keys with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of crisis management. "I need to find Keith," she said, heading for the door. "You two stay here and keep tracking Robert on the cameras. If you lose sight of him, radio me immediately." The door slammed behind her, leaving Molly and me alone with the bank of monitors showing empty aisles and flickering shadows. I pulled a chair up next to Molly and watched her fingers fly across the keyboard, switching between camera feeds with practiced ease. "There," she said, pointing to monitor 3. "Keith's in the back warehouse." The camera showed Keith methodically organizing boxes on metal shelving, completely absorbed in his work. He had no idea that somewhere in the maze of storage areas, a man with a history of violence was hunting for him. "Where's Robert?" I asked. Molly switched to another feed. "Lost him near the loading dock. The cameras back there have blind spots." She bit her lip, scanning the other monitors. "Julie's smart to go looking for Keith. If Robert knows the building layout from when he worked here, he could approach from anywhere," I finished. We watched Keith work, and I felt this horrible, helpless feeling, watching someone who had no clue he was in danger. On monitor 5, I caught a glimpse of Julie moving quickly through the grocery section, her radio pressed to her ear. "There," Molly pointed to monitor 7. "Loading dock entrance." Robert Weber was slipping through a service door, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The blue baseball cap was pulled low over his face, but I could see something metallic glinting in his right hand. "Oh God," I whispered. "Is that a knife?" Molly was already reaching for the radio, but I was moving before she could speak. The helpless feeling transformed into something else entirely. The same protective instinct that had made me drop out of school when my mom got sick, that made me work 3 jobs to pay for her medical bills. "Teresa, wait." But I was already out the door, running through the store toward the back warehouse. My sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as I dodged around displays and end caps, following the path I'd memorized during our earlier trips to storage. The warehouse felt different now, bigger and more threatening, with shadows that seemed to hide potential dangers behind every stack of boxes. I could hear voices ahead, low and tense, and I slowed down as I got closer. "Told you to stop digging into things that don't concern you." Robert's voice, sharp with barely controlled anger. I crept forward until I could see around a stack of paper towel cases. Keith was standing near the electronics storage area, his hands raised slightly, facing Robert Weber, who was indeed holding a knife. The blade caught the harsh warehouse lighting, and Keith's face was pale but determined. "Kevin was my brother," Keith said quietly. "Everything about his death concerns me." "Your brother was a problem," Robert snarled. "Just like you're becoming a problem. Kevin couldn't leave well enough alone, kept asking questions, kept digging through files he had no business touching. So you killed him." I was hired to keep him quiet. The killing part, Robert shrugged. That was his choice. He could have taken the money and kept his mouth shut like everyone else. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I needed to do something. But what? Robert was bigger than both Keith and me, and he had a weapon. I looked around desperately for anything that might help. That's when I saw it. A red fire alarm pull station mounted on the wall about 10 feet away. "The executives you're working for," Keith was saying. "They're using the night shift to hide embezzled funds, aren't they? Moving stolen merchandise through the store after hours. Smart boy. Too smart for your own good." Robert took a step closer and Keith backed up against the shelving. Just like Kevin, he found the hidden compartment, started copying documents, thought he was going to be some kind of hero. I made my decision. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept toward the fire alarm, staying low behind the stacked merchandise. If I could create enough chaos and noise, maybe Keith could get away. Maybe security would come running. "Where's the compartment?" Keith asked. "Where did Kevin hide the evidence?" Robert laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You think I'm going to tell you that? You think I'm stupid enough to—" I yanked the fire alarm. The sound was deafening, a piercing wail that echoed through the warehouse and made everyone freeze for a split second. In that moment of confusion, Keith lunged forward and grabbed Robert's wrist, trying to wrestle the knife away. They crashed into the shelving, sending boxes tumbling to the floor. I ran toward them, not sure what I was going to do, but knowing I couldn't just stand there. Keith was stronger than he looked, but Robert was desperate and vicious, clawing at Keith's face with his free hand while trying to twist the knife toward him. "Get off him!" I shouted, grabbing a heavy box and swinging it at Robert's head. The impact sent him staggering sideways, and Keith managed to slam Robert's wrist against the metal shelving until he dropped the knife. It clattered across the concrete floor, spinning away from all of us. That's when Julie burst through the warehouse entrance with 2 security guards behind her, all of them running toward the sound of the alarm and the shouting. Robert took one look at the approaching reinforcements and tried to bolt, but Keith tackled him from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground. "Stay down!" one of the security guards yelled, pulling out zip-tie restraints. "Robert Weber, you're under arrest for trespassing and assault." As they hauled Robert to his feet, he looked directly at Keith with pure hatred. "You have no idea what you're getting into. The people I work for don't give up. They don't forgive." "Then they can explain that to the police," Julie said coldly, pulling out her phone, "and to the FBI investigators who've been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence." The fire alarm was still wailing, but I could see the first hints of dawn creeping through the high windows of the warehouse. Our shift was almost over, but somehow I knew the real work was just beginning. Keith was staring at the spot where Robert had been standing, his face thoughtful despite everything that had just happened. "He mentioned a hidden compartment," Keith said, "where Kevin hid documents." Julie nodded. "We'll find it. Now that we have Robert in custody, we can search properly." She looked at both of us with something like pride. "You two did good tonight. Really good." As the security guards led Robert away and the fire alarm finally stopped shrieking, I realized that Julie was right. This job had never really been about restocking shelves or following weird supernatural rules. It had been about finding people trustworthy enough to help uncover the truth. People who would follow instructions and watch out for each other when things got dangerous. I looked at Keith, who was already examining the shelving where Robert had been standing, searching for any sign of his brother's hidden evidence. The morning shift would be arriving soon, and the police would want statements, and there would probably be paperwork and investigations and all kinds of complications. But for the first time since I'd started this job, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to keep working nights. Julie needed allies, Keith needed support, and maybe, just maybe, we could make sure this place became safe for everyone who worked here. Besides, after everything we'd been through tonight, regular retail work was going to seem pretty boring.